No matter how many soldiers and pieces of equipment his military loses, Russian President Vladimir Putin won't stop his assaults. Zaporizhzhia is one of his biggest targets, and it has been since the summer. Russia failed to take the ground Putin wanted during a massive summer assault, meaning Putin now has until the end of the fall to launch major attacks. And on October 20th, he did just that. Targeting a small village on the outskirts of Zaporizhzhia, Russia unleashed a huge mechanized assault designed to crush Ukraine's defenses. It didn't work. Putin's massive assault at Zaporizhzhia has exploded into chaos, leaving Russia dealing with yet another unexpected defeat. On October 21st, Kyiv Post reported that Russia had attempted to launch a large assault against the village of Mala Tokmachka just a day earlier. That report came directly from Ukrainian military officials, who also said that Ukraine did what it has done to so many of Russia's mechanized assaults in recent months, stopped it in its tracks. Russia had clearly been preparing to take Mala Tokmachka for a while. Its assault was well organized, and if Ukraine hadn't been prepared for it, it might have been enough to take the village. The Russian attack came in multiple waves, most of which appeared to belong to Russia's 71st Motorized Rifle Regiment. The troops advanced from the villages of Verbova and Novoprokopivka, the Kyiv Post reports. This suggests that Russia was attempting to combine its wave-based assaults with an approach from two directions, perhaps hoping to complete a pincer movement against Ukraine. Whatever the intention may have been, the assault didn't work. Each of the Russian waves consisted of between 5 and 8 armored vehicles, the Kyiv Post adds. This is a reversion to type for Russia. During the summer, it had switched to assault tactics that relied more on small groups of infiltrators than they did on mechanized assaults using armored vehicles. This change in tactical direction was reported by RBC Ukraine in July. Often, Russian groups were as small as 3 or 4 soldiers who were tasked with advancing and penetrating into Ukrainian positions without being noticed. Mechanized units were too large, the theory seemed to be. Armored vehicles make for big targets for Ukraine's drones and artillery. The Kyiv Post continues, noting that Russia ultimately ended up deploying a rough total of 26 mechanized units, including infantry fighting vehicles and armored fighting vehicles that included its Tiger. Also known as the Tiger M, this vehicle can carry up to 10 soldiers and is armed with both a grenade launcher and a light machine gun, Army recognition reports. It can reach a maximum speed between 77 and 87 miles per hour, depending on the specific model, and it has an impressive 621-mile range. All solid specs that should make it a good choice for conducting an assault on a village, but those specifications weren't enough to save the Tiger, or Russia's other armored vehicles, from Ukraine's defenses. Based on the numbers the Kyiv Post shares, we can assume that Russia launched between 3 and 5 waves based on the approximation of 5 to 8 vehicles per wave. This wave-based approach had been the Russian tactic for much of the war before it switched to its smaller units. The first couple of waves are essentially kamikaze assaults designed to drain Ukraine's ammunition, leaving it vulnerable to follow-up waves. Of course, the limitation of these wave assaults is always the number of vehicles that Russia has available. Once those vehicles run out, which is likely to happen unless Ukraine burns through its stockpiles of drones and ammunition, the assault fails. Ukraine knows this, and it was ready for what Russia attempted to do at Mala Tokmachka. The country's 118th Separate Mechanized Brigade caught the Russian forces as they attempted to make their advance, with soldiers from the brigade claiming that they struck back quickly. Using artillery, first-person view or FPV drones, and other unmanned aerial vehicles, Ukraine's defenders targeted Russia's positions. Ukraine also took a page out of Russia's book by deploying Soviet-era T-72 tanks into the fight. It's unknown if these tanks came from Ukraine's stockpiles or if they had been captured from Russia, but Ukraine used them to great effect. The T-72s engaged Russia's armored vehicles and infantry directly as the drones flew and the artillery shells exploded. Plus, there were mines. Several of Russia's armored vehicles ran afoul of explosives from below while trying to escape the drones flying above. To counter any attempt by Russia to claim the Mala Tokmachka assault was more successful than it actually was, the 118th Brigade also shared a video of its response to the attack in a Facebook reel. Lasting a little over 3 minutes, the video highlights many of the techniques Ukraine used to take out the Russian occupiers. Set against the backdrop of thumping music, the footage shows Russian vehicles being struck by FPV drones, leaving trails of smoke and crippled metal in their wake. Some of the vehicles managed to keep moving after being hit for the first time, but that only leads to follow-up strikes by more drones. In one piece of footage, we see the view from one FPV drone as another scores a direct hit on a Russian vehicle. The vehicle doesn't stop, so the drone recording the footage draws in closer. Eventually, we see that the vehicle has what appears to be barbed wire strapped to it, which is what has become known as a cope cage. Cope cages are improvised pieces of armor that both Russia and Ukraine strap to their tanks and armored vehicles. The idea is to provide armor for the armor. In a war where drones can descend from above to tackle a vehicle's weak points, with anti-tank munitions doing the same, a cope cage is supposed to trigger an early explosion and bear the brunt of the firepower, leaving the vehicle below safe to continue its advance. The Russian cope cage may have worked against Ukraine's first drone. The second scores a direct hit on the side of the vehicle. And so it goes in the video. Time and time again, we see FPV drones either recording other strikes or recording hits on Russia's vehicles. The situation in this direction is under control. No position has been lost, the text accompanying the video declares. The Kyiv Post offers another quote from Ukraine's troops, which added, "The enemy suffered significant losses. Personnel and armored vehicles were destroyed. We are working in a coordinated and decisive manner." Russia's assault ended up not being an assault at all. It was a massacre of metal machines that Russia still seems unable to protect against Ukraine's drones and other weapons. Euromaidan Press reports the scale of the losses, and they're huge. Of the 26 armored units the Kyiv Post says Russia deployed, 22 were either destroyed or otherwise lost to Ukraine's counterattack. Among them were 12 infantry fighting vehicles, 2 Tigers and 6 armored personnel carriers. Presumably, many of these vehicles would have been carrying troops, meaning it's not just armor that Russia lost on its ill-fated attempt to take Mala Tokmachka. We'll have lost soldiers too, potentially dozens, though Ukraine doesn't reveal the full scale of the casualties. This latest Ukrainian victory comes at a key time for several reasons, not least of which is that Russia has launched a renewed offensive on Zaporizhzhia following the abject failure of the summer offensive. That offensive began toward the end of summer. On August 18th, the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces, Alexander Syrskyi, reported that Russia has diverted troops previously operating in the Sumy region to Zaporizhzhia. That alone was an admission of summer failure. Russia has been launching attacks in Sumy since May with the intention of creating a buffer zone intended to protect its vulnerable border regions. The Sumy offensive failed, and it looks like Russia diverted many of the survivors or reserves it had in the region to another area of Ukraine where it thought they might have more luck. That regrouping was confirmed a few days later, but Russia's summer offensive in Zaporizhzhia still failed. Still, the troop deployment meant that Russia was prepared to launch more assaults in the fall, which is precisely what we saw on October 20th. By September, Syrskyi was reporting that Russia holds a threefold advantage in both manpower and equipment in most regions of Zaporizhzhia. That advantage extends to between 4 and 6 times the number of soldiers and equipment Ukraine can deploy in some areas, Syrskyi added. This is Russia's strategy in a nutshell, and we saw what that numerical advantage can mean in the assault on Mala Tokmachka. Russia can afford to deploy and lose so many mechanized units because it has others it can send in future waves. At least it has them right now. In Zaporizhzhia, much will depend on Ukraine's drone and ammunition stockpiles. Russia's armor is vulnerable. The question is whether it's so numerous that Russia will be able to overcome this vulnerability with sheer numbers alone. Right now, the defense is holding. Toward the end of summer, Russia had planned several large-scale offensives in Zaporizhzhia. However, Ukraine managed to stall those offensives before they began, the Kyiv Post reports. Russia decided to divert troops, including elite marine units, to Donetsk, likely in an attempt to push on into Pokrovsk. The assaults on Zaporizhzhia slowed down, though they were still plentiful. In fact, the month when the Russian military made maximum efforts to break through became a month of relatively small territorial gains, Syrskyi said back in August. Perhaps the offensives Russia is launching in the fall are the assaults it was supposed to launch in the summer. Ukraine is still defending, and as October 20th proved, it has more than enough skill and firepower to destroy Russia's armor before it can make any real dent in Ukraine's defenses. Still, armor isn't the only thing that Ukraine has to worry about in Zaporizhzhia. Drones are also causing major issues. On October 22nd, just a couple of days after Russia launched its failed mechanized assault on Mala Tokmachka, yet another horde of Russia's long-range drones was launched at Zaporizhzhia. UKR Inform was among the first outlets to report on the strike, noting that 5 people had been injured during Russia's attack. Russia doesn't discriminate when it comes to the ages of the Ukrainian civilians that it targets. The youngest was 21, with the eldest being 62. Shrapnel wounds and carbon monoxide poisoning were among the initial injuries being reported. We say initial because the true injury toll ended up being much worse. A few hours after UKR Inform's report, Pravda issued a follow-up, stating that the injury toll in Zaporizhzhia had risen to 15. As of this latest report, 3 children have been added to the list of victims of Russia's long-range drones. 2 of those children are infants, one aged 7 months and the other 6 months. The other is a 13-year-old boy. We mentioned earlier that the mechanized assault on Mala Tokmachka demonstrates Russia reverting to tactics that it had used constantly before the summer. With these drone strikes, Russia continues to do something that it's done from the moment the Ukraine war started: terrorize Ukraine's civilians. Action on Armed Violence provides the numbers as of October 17th. It reports that there have been 10,309 incidents affecting Ukraine's civilians, leading to 42,569 casualties. Of those casualties, 33,372 civilians have been injured, and 9,297 have died as a result of their wounds. Air-launched weapons like the drones Russia used to target Zaporizhzhia on October 21st and into October 22nd have been responsible for 29% of all civilian deaths reported since Putin launched his invasion. Zaporizhzhia is also one of the 5 most impacted regions when it comes to Russia's attacks on civilians, having recorded 2,917 casualties as of October 17th. This most recent drone strike raises that number by 15. And it also shows us that Russia is getting desperate in Zaporizhzhia. It's now combining mechanized assaults that it knows are likely to fail, costing it valuable equipment and soldiers in the process, with a concerted campaign of terror against the region's civilians. Russia is getting desperate, and what we're now seeing is its attempts to make up for the outright flop that was the country's summer offensive against Ukraine. We've touched on this failure already, but we haven't highlighted just how massive that failure was or how much damage it's done to Russia. On September 2nd, the Atlantic Council published an article that summed up the impact the failed summer offensive had on Russia. It declares that this one failure shatters the myth of inevitable Russian victory that will sting Putin. The idea of the summer offensive in Zaporizhzhia and elsewhere was for Russia to unleash a force so overwhelming that Ukraine wouldn't be able to stop it. Russia would advance at pace, snatching up massive amounts of territory, and when it was all over, Putin would be able to enter peace negotiations with more leverage than he's had at any point during the war. "Look at how much territory we took during the summer," Putin would have been able to say. "Cede that territory to Russia, or we will take the rest of Ukraine." Putin himself was so confident in the summer offensive that he claimed, "There are reasons to believe we can finish off Ukraine back in March." The outcome of the offensive was not what Putin had in mind, as the Atlantic Council notes. The Russian army has been unable to secure any frontline breakthroughs or capture a single major city, with overall Russian advances during the 3 summer months limited to an estimated 0.3% of Ukrainian territory. Crucially, key strategic objectives like Pokrovsk in eastern Ukraine remain in Ukrainian hands, it reported in September. Not a lot has changed as we approach the end of October. Any hope that Putin had of using Russia's summer gains as leverage to obtain the peace that he wanted has evaporated into thin air. By the end of the summer, Putin had a staggering 210,000 casualties on his hands for all of 2025 and very little to show for it. You can learn more about how devastating this offensive ended up being for Russia in our video covering the full scale of Russia's losses in 2025. All of this brings us back to Mala Tokmachka and the renewed drone assaults on Zaporizhzhia. What Ukraine is dealing with now is a Russia that is beyond desperate. Having failed to achieve its summer objectives, the country is now throwing everything that it has left at Ukraine before the winter cold makes serious ground-based advances far more difficult. The armor Russia unleashed in the Mala Tokmachka direction would likely have been the armor Russia wanted to keep, perhaps ready for future assaults once winter passed. Instead, much of it is now burned out on the field and roads surrounding a small village that Russia failed to take. As for the drones, that's all that Russia really has left to do any serious damage in Zaporizhzhia. Unable to gain the ground that it wants, Russia is leaning even more heavily on its terror tactics. That's according to the new Voice of Ukraine, which said in September that Russia is focusing on improving its tactical position rather than making any serious gains in Zaporizhzhia during the fall. The assault on Mala Tokmachka likely plays a role in this adjusted strategy, as it's the sort of settlement that Russia could use as a staging ground for future assaults or a base for its drone operators as they attempt to attack the rest of the Zaporizhzhia region. Russian forces will now seek to improve their tactical position in Zaporizhzhia Oblast to prevent Ukrainian defenders from transferring reserves to other, more active fronts and for terrorist purposes, such as moving closer to the regional capital to strike it with guided aerial bombs, KABs, the outlet said at the time. These terror tactics are supposed to give the impression that Russia is winning, the Moscow Times reported on October 21st. Putin is still pushing for Ukraine to cede territory, even as his forces fail to capture that territory. Russia's leader is so detached from the reality of what's happening on the ground, the Moscow Times says, that he even claimed that Ukrainian forces were retreating across the entire line of contact on October 7th. That isn't happening. Either Putin doesn't know this isn't happening, or those closest to him are lying. That offers even more context for the assault on Mala Tokmachka. Russia may have thrown so much of its armor at the village because it's trying to turn Putin's delusions into a reality, before Putin finds out what he says doesn't match the situation on the ground. Right now, the Moscow Times says Russia is concentrating its military units in Zaporizhzhia and Donetsk for what Putin believes will be a final assault on Donbass. Advancing in Zaporizhzhia will allow Russia to send troops across the border into the Donbass, which is why Putin is targeting the region. Russia's problem is that its current rate of advance suggests that this so-called final assault could require years of fighting before the Donbass ultimately falls. As for Ukraine, it will continue doing what it did on October 20th. The defense of Mala Tokmachka shows that Ukraine knows exactly how Russia is going to attack, and that it's prepared for the relaunched mechanized assaults Russia is using now. Russia will keep hitting anything it can, from military targets to civilian infrastructure, as it attempts to create the impression of an advance in Zaporizhzhia. All Ukraine has to do is continue defending like it did in Mala Tokmachka, providing evidence via video footage along the way, and Putin's narrative of an inevitable Russian victory will come unstuck. If there is one country upon which Russia has been able to rely for a steady flow of cash during the Ukraine war, it's China. As Western nations sanctioned Russia and started moving away from the country's oil, China seized the opportunity to buy more. The deal worked out. China got more oil at a discounted rate, and Russia kept receiving money it could use to fund the war. Now everything has changed. China's President Xi Jinping has betrayed Vladimir Putin by delivering a crippling blow to Russia's war machine. And it's a blow that couldn't have happened without the US and its sanctions. On October 23rd, The Telegraph reported that several of China's state-owned oil companies have suspended all purchases of Russian seaborne oil. The words state-owned tell you everything that you need to know about Xi's involvement in the decision. The Communist Party of China, which Xi leads, essentially owns these companies, meaning the decision to suspend purchases would have ultimately been made by Xi. Right now, 4 of China's biggest oil companies have called a halt to their purchases. Sinopec, CNOOC, PetroChina, and Zhenhua Oil all have temporary suspensions in place as they await to see what the future brings. And that brings us to the big question: why? As we mentioned earlier, China has been enjoying the fruits of a great deal with Russia since Putin invaded Ukraine. It's been buying oil by the millions of barrels and spending far less on that oil than it would if it purchased it from other suppliers. For Xi to say no more seaborne oil, something major must have happened, and it did. The US sanctioned 2 of Russia's largest oil companies. China's decision to suspend its Russian oil purchases comes in the wake of the US implementing sanctions that target Rosneft and Lukoil. The 2 companies are Russia's second and third largest energy giants, with both coming behind natural gas behemoth Gazprom when it comes to the sheer amount of revenue they generate, both for their owners and for Russia's wartime coffers. Al Jazeera reports that the 2 companies collectively export about 3.1 million barrels of crude oil per day, creating an approximate annual total of 1.1315 billion barrels. That's enough to account for 70% of all Russia's crude oil exports, making the US decision to target these companies a very intelligent move. Rosneft and Lukoil are 2 of Russia's heavy hitters. Losing their sales will be devastating to Putin and his war machine. The US decision comes on the back of the UK implementing similar sanctions against the same 2 companies, suggesting that the collective West is purposefully targeting Russia's seaborne oil sales. When the sanctions were announced, Russia must have known that some of its buyers would become casualties, but China, Russia's largest importer of seaborne oil, surely that one country has the economic might to stand up to the US sanctions and continue buying from Russia. Apparently not. And we'll explain why later in the video. Now that we know that the US is behind Xi's betrayal of Putin, the next why question is, why did the US choose now to go after 2 of Russia's largest oil giants? The answer is that it's all Putin's fault. Just a few days ago, US President Donald Trump was preparing to meet Putin in Hungary for a summit that would allow the 2 leaders to discuss how to move the Ukraine war peace process forward. That summit was unexpectedly cancelled, with Trump declaring that he has no interest in taking part in a wasted meeting with Putin. On October 22nd, Trump elaborated on these comments, stating, "Every time I speak to Vladimir, I have good conversations, and then they don't go anywhere." What we see here are signs of frustration with Putin building in the US administration. Those frustrations have now boiled over, with the sanctions that have caused Xi's betrayal of Putin being the direct result. "I just felt it was time. We waited a long time," Trump said when asked why he implemented the new sanctions. The US president adds that he hopes the pain these sanctions cause will bring Putin to the negotiating table once more, and more importantly, that Russia's leader will actually arrive with a productive mindset. So this was a punishment for Putin, and it's one that has shocked the Kremlin to its core. That's according to the Kyiv Independent, which expanded on just how deep the US sanctions go. America hasn't just targeted the main companies of Rosneft and Lukoil. 6 of Lukoil's subsidiaries, along with 28 companies that fall under the Rosneft banner, have fallen victim to the US sanctions. Just one of the Lukoil subsidiaries alone, Lukoil Western Siberia, accounts for around 40% of Lukoil's hydrocarbon production, the outlet adds. Trump's new sanctions aren't just for show. The US has done its research to implement a sanctions package that covers every possible base. The one saving grace for Russia is that the sanctions aren't going to come into force all at once. That's according to Chatham House Associate Fellow Timothy Ash, who tells The Telegraph, these sanctions will be rolled out over 4 weeks, so Russia will still have time to figure out countermeasures, but it will increase the discount Russia has to offer customers to buy its oil, and that means lower budget revenues at a time when its buffers have already been worn down after 3.5 years of war. Perhaps China will eventually benefit from that discount again in the future. But for now, Xi has betrayed Putin, willingly or otherwise, as the US has finally flexed a muscle big enough to make China stand up and take notice. China isn't especially happy about having to suspend its seaborne Russian oil purchases. In its report on the US sanctions, Newsweek notes that China opposes what the US is doing and has suggested that the sanctions have no basis in international law. China also bemoaned the fact that the sanctions haven't received authorization from the United Nations Security Council. Guo Jiakun, who is a spokesperson for China's foreign ministry, made these points and added, "Dialogue and negotiation are the only feasible ways to resolve the Ukraine crisis, rather than coercion and pressure." Guo may have a point, though the legality aspect is a complicated legal issue. The UK's House of Commons Library explained why in a November 2024 article, explaining how sanctions operate in conjunction with international law. The use of sanctions by states, particularly outside the framework of the United Nations Security Council, has a complicated relationship with international law. Depending on the measures adopted by a state, sanctions could be an entirely legal exercise of its sovereignty or a potentially unlawful breach of international law that would require some justification, the library says. So it's possible that the US may face some blowback for its move from the United Nations Security Council. How much power the Council would have to stop the US is up for debate, assuming the Council would even want to get involved with these new sanctions. In the end, China's complaints don't amount to much, as the US has managed to push some of Beijing's biggest energy companies into halting their Russian oil purchases. That's bad enough for Putin and his Ukraine war effort. However, it's not just China that's betraying Russia under US pressure. India seems to be on its way out the door too, and if India follows China's lead, that's 2 of Russia's biggest oil customers, saying they will no longer be spending billions of dollars on Russia's most valuable product. On October 22nd, CNBC reported that India is already planning to cut its oil purchases from Russia in the wake of the new US sanctions. Trump himself says that he has received assurances from Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi of that decision to move away from Russian oil. Talking to reporters aboard Air Force One, the US president said, "He's not going to buy much oil from Russia. He wants to see that war end as much as I do. He wants to see the war end with Russia, Ukraine, and as you know, they're not going to be buying too much oil." Of course, there's a pretty big carrot hanging on the end of a stick that's encouraging India to make this decision. CNBC notes that the US is likely going to slash the 50% tariff it currently has in place on Indian exports to the 15% range in return for India's decision. Again, this is the US flexing its financial muscle, proving to Putin that it has the power to make even those who benefit most from Russia's cheap oil turn away from him. Modi and Xi benefit more than most. They are now betraying Putin. And Ukraine is very happy with the pressure that Trump is exerting. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky used his platform on X to laud the US sanctions on October 23rd. The new US sanctions against Russia's oil giants are a clear signal that prolonging the war and spreading terror come at a cost. And this is a fair and absolutely deserved step. It's precisely pressure on Russia that will be effective for achieving peace, and sanctions are one of its key components, Zelensky claimed. His comments were mirrored by Ukraine's sanctions envoy Vladislav Vlasyuk, who took to Facebook to add, "All of this is now under sanctions. The remarkable aspect of this decision is its complexity and comprehensiveness. The full infrastructure is targeted, exactly the way it should be. I think this will have a quick and great effect. No one will want to buy oil from these exporters, as there will be a risk of secondary US sanctions." Russia's response has been less effusive. Privately, Putin must be absolutely kicking himself, as if it was his stubborn refusal to budge from his maximalist demands for a Ukraine war peace deal that led Trump to deciding any meeting right now would be useless. Russia's president has spent the entire year trying to play Trump, and at times it seemed like he was succeeding. Now he faces renewed economic pressure as the war that he started crawls closer to the end of its 4th year. The Guardian reports that Putin tried to put a brave face on it all. He called the sanctions an unfriendly act that does nothing to strengthen Russian-American relations, in what seems like a desperate attempt to convince Trump that he will hurt his own country by placing so much pressure on Russia. Putin encouraged Trump to think about who his administration is really working for, in an odd measure that was accompanied by Putin making a vague claim that the sanctions would lead to a rise in prices. But as for what Russia is going to do next, Putin has a much clearer message. No self-respecting country ever does anything under pressure. Those words imply that Putin has no intention of backing down from his Ukraine war, and may now even be less likely to come to the negotiating table than he was before. Is Putin serious? Or is this all bluster as Putin scrambles to find a way to convince the US to back down from measures that he knows deep down are going to cause some serious damage? We will have to wait and see. Other Russian commentators have been less diplomatic in their approaches. Kremlin mouthpiece Dmitry Medvedev has thrown around the usual threats that arise whenever anything happens that doesn't go in Russia's favor. The US is our enemy, and their talkative peacemaker has now fully embarked on the warpath with Russia. The decisions taken are an act of war against Russia, and now Trump has fully aligned himself with loony Europe, Medvedev raged in response to the US sanctions. Of course, Medvedev exists to say things that Putin himself won't say, so his words are essentially Putin's true feelings on the matter. Putin is panicking because he knows that losing China's oil purchases is going to hurt. That brings us nicely to the impact that China's betrayal of Russia caused by the new US sanctions has the potential to have. The most direct and obvious impact is monetary. China was buying a lot of Russian oil, to the point where it was contributing tens of billions of dollars to Putin's wartime economy. In 2024 alone, China purchased $62.59 billion of Russian crude oil, according to Trading Economics. That year also broke the record for the most money that China had ever spent on Russia's most important product. That record had been broken 2 times before, in 2023 and 2022. China spent $60.7 billion on Russian crude oil in 2023 and $58.4 billion in 2022. And if there's any doubt that China was taking advantage of Russia's oil being cheaper due to the war, its 2021 crude purchases amounted to a little over $40 billion. China has been spending about $20 billion more on Russian crude per year since Putin invaded Ukraine than it spent the year before the invasion started. Now, China isn't cancelling all of its Russian oil purchases. Its decision only accounts for seaborne oil imports, which Reuters says amounts to 1.4 million barrels per day. Another Reuters article notes that China's total imports of Russian oil amount to 2.1 million daily barrels. Right now, land-based imports don't seem to be affected by China's decision. The maths works out pretty conveniently here to reveal that 2/3 of China's Russian crude imports arrive by the sea. That's what China is cutting off. And it also allows us to get a bead on how much of a financial impact Xi's decision will have on Putin's war effort. As we see from the figures shared earlier, China is spending roughly $60 billion on Russian oil annually. If 2/3 of those purchases are going to stop, that's $40 billion in oil revenue that Putin can no longer tax to support his country's military or his country in general. This is no small chunk of change. It's a potentially game-changing amount to lose at a time when Russian ministers are warning that Russia is on the brink of a recession. Add India into the mix and you get some serious damage to Russia. The $230 billion or so that Newsweek claims China has spent on Russian oil since February 2022 is accompanied by almost $160 billion of purchases from India. That $230 billion figure clashes slightly with the Trading Economics figure. The point still stands that it's a lot of money. With India also cutting off the supply of Russian oil, perhaps even more permanently than China, if it gets the tariff deal it's looking for, you have a recipe for disaster that will push Russia over the precipice into complete economic collapse. And it's not just the money side of the trade impact that's going to deliver a swift kick to Putin's gut. It's what all of this means for the relationship between China and Russia going forward. China has always outwardly claimed that it wants to see a peaceful resolution to the Ukraine war, but in its actions, China has typically been behind Russia. The massive oil purchases pumping billions into Russia's economy are proof of that. And as the Telegraph reported in September, China has also happily sold dual-use components to Russia that can be used in the construction of drones. Engineers from China have even worked with a sanctioned Russian weapons manufacturer to help Putin's forces make their drones more effective. On the surface, the relationship between Russia and China looked strong. However, the reality is that China has been taking advantage of Russia's weak position, especially when it comes to buying Putin's oil. It's no coincidence that China's purchases of Russian crude oil rocketed up when Putin launched the Ukraine war. Sanctions ripped through Russia's oil industry, forcing Russia to offer its oil to countries like China at a lower price than it would usually have asked for. China has spent the last 3 years or so taking full advantage, knowing that it could pull the plug at any time to leave Russia in a precarious position. It's China that has all of the power in this supposed alliance. And with a push from the US, it has just exercised that power. Oil may have once brought Russia and China closer together, but it's also the source of a massive power imbalance that Putin wants to pretend doesn't exist. The European Union Institute for Security Studies, or EUISS, highlighted this imbalance in an October 2nd article. It noted that China has thrown its weight behind Russia for so long because China and Russia share some ideological similarities. The dismantling of the Western power structure is one of them, and it's likely the driving force behind the relationship. However, China has been the dominant partner every step of the way, and cutting off its oil purchases now demonstrates to Putin how subservient he has made Russia to China. Despite consistent growth in imports and exports in recent years, the Russia-China economic relationship remains deeply asymmetrical, the EUISS says. Russia is becoming increasingly reliant on China across a widening range of product categories, while Beijing maintains minimal exposure to Russian inputs. China may not have decided to cut off its Russian oil purchases right now if it had the choice, but the odds are that it won't be too angry about being pushed into doing so. This single act highlights Russia's growing dependency on China as a provider of money, and Xi may now be plotting to dig his talons deeper into Russia. Perhaps a demand for even greater discounts is on the horizon in return for China reactivating its purchases. There's a natural argument for China to make here, as those discounts can cover the cost of angering the US and exposing itself to secondary sanctions. China also knows that it's a far more valuable trading partner to the US than Russia will ever be. The Office of the United States Trade Representative highlights this. It says that US trade of goods and services with China totaled $658.9 billion in 2024. Trade with Russia was just $3.5 billion during the same year. This massive disparity gives China a ton of leverage that it can use to renegotiate itself into a better position with the US in the future, even if it does end up buying Russian oil again. China has a win-win on its hands here. It could use the US sanctions and its response to them as a way to reopen dialogue with the US over the tariff war that consumes both the US and China right now. Russia would be left in the dust if China makes that choice. Or China could resume Russian oil purchases at an even lower rate than ever because it knows that its sheer economic strength will be enough for it to be able to renegotiate with the US in the future. In this scenario, Russia gets some short-term relief, but it still ends up potentially being abandoned by China in the future, and if not abandoned, then made even more subservient than it already is. There are some caveats. As we mentioned earlier, the oil trade between China and Russia isn't going to stop entirely, as land-based transportation is still an option. The cutoff only affects seaborne oil. Plus, as the Telegraph notes, analysts are already suggesting that the Chinese cutoff is temporary and that Russia and China may work together to find a workaround. That would be the best-case scenario for Putin, but even if a workaround is found, Putin has just learned the very harsh lesson that China is willing to abandon Russia to its economic fate if enough pressure is placed upon Beijing. Putin needs Xi a lot more than Xi needs Putin. And there's nothing Russia's president can do to change that fact.
Do your patriotic duty and ensure that Russia defeats Ukraine. That's the propaganda-laced message that the Kremlin has been delivering to anybody who will listen. This concept of duty is all that stands between the Russian military and complete collapse, and it's one that Russia needs to hold firm for it to stand any chance of defeating Ukraine. But that idea hasn't exactly held up. Duty has gone right out of the window. Russia's military is falling apart amidst frontline madness, equipment shortages, and incidents that suggest Russia's supposedly patriotic soldiers are turning against one another. And perhaps the only evidence needed to prove that, though plenty more will follow, is that Russian soldiers are shooting their own comrades. These aren't isolated incidents. Russians shooting Russians happens far too often for Vladimir Putin's comfort. And it's a problem that spans everything from Russian commanders giving the orders to crazed Russian soldiers losing their minds and killing everyone in sight in a desperate hunt for an escape from the brutality of the Ukraine war. One of these incidents has happened very recently. Euromaidan press reports that a Russian conscript has opened fire on his comrades while serving at a military base in the Moscow region. The soldier hit his target as he managed to kill 2 people and wound another. For this particular soldier, escape from the base wasn't an option. He would have been caught and faced harsh Russian justice. So, rather than trying to run, he escaped by turning his gun on himself. 1 bullet later, a 3rd Russian was dead. This is just the latest in many such incidents that have plagued Russia's military. Almost a year before the conscript took out 2 comrades before killing himself, Newsweek reported on a similar story that occurred in Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia region. This time, a former Russian prisoner stationed on the front lines executed a far more elaborate plan. His name is Maxim Fedorchenko, and he went out of his way to cause as much damage to his own people as possible. Newsweek says that the former prisoner tossed a grenade into the dugout where his comrade slept. Following the explosion, he emerged with a gun in hand to shoot anybody who survived the blast. Then, he ran. And nobody knows what became of him. Why is a former prisoner serving on the front lines in Ukraine, one might wonder. This video covers Frontline madness, and it's a Putin-approved policy that led to Fedorchenko being in Ukraine in the first place. Desperate to bolster his forces, Putin created a new law through which Russian convicts would be given the option of serving their sentences or fighting for Russia in Ukraine. In January, the Kyiv Independent reported that as many as 180,000 Russian convicts are now fighting in Ukraine, many of whom would have been convicted of violent crimes. To Russia, it seems to make sense to have unpredictable criminals serving in its military. Fedorchenko's story shows why it isn't. And if it's not conscripts losing their minds or criminals turning guns on their comrades that Russia's soldiers have to worry about, it's orders from their own commanders. There have been several reports of Russian soldiers being killed by order of the very people who are leading them into battle, often as a result of supposed cowardice. In April, the Kyiv Independent reported on one such incident, noting that Ukraine's military intelligence had recently intercepted a call suggesting that one Russian commander had let his temper get the best of him. "F the 55th, the commander says of another unit. "Shoot them. That's the battalion commander's order. Shoot them," the commander screamed during the call. Draw conclusions about what must have happened next. In July, the Anti-Imperial Bloc of Nations, or ABN, published a piece highlighting how this angry call was far from a one-off incident. It noted that Russian soldiers are killing their wounded comrades either with headshots or strikes with the butts of their guns. Ukraine has apparently seen this firsthand via footage that its drones have captured, and these executions of the wounded appear to be happening systematically, ABN says. The word systematically suggests one thing: this is an order that must have come from Russian command. In one of the videos, a wounded Russian can be seen lying in a trench, moving his arms and head. Another soldier approaches him, examines him, and then hits him 3 times on the head with a rifle butt, then steps over the body and moves on. ABN reports. It appears that wounded Russian soldiers risk being executed or left behind rather than receiving medical evacuation. "Do your duty in Ukraine," Russia cries. Dying in Ukraine at the hands of fellow comrades seemed to be the reality, at least for many of Russia's soldiers. Euromaidan Press says that incidents such as these are far from rare in the Russian military, especially among the newly drafted recruits. Soldier morale is in the toilet, with reports from troops and their relatives suggesting that many are being driven to the darkest depths of desperation by bullying, deprivation, and an unending sense of hopelessness in their situation. Many who are serving on the front or training so they can be sent in the future know that they're very likely to die. Russia's younger conscripts aren't blind to everything that's happening in Ukraine. They see footage from the front, learn from returning soldiers, and know what awaits them in Ukraine, Euromaidan Press says. Many try to flee, but harsh new laws criminalize even online searches for information deemed extremist, a label that conveniently includes criticism of the war. Perhaps what Russia is experiencing now is a morale crisis that it has failed to address, coming to a head. After all, it's not like there haven't been warning signs. As far back as July 2023, captured Russian soldiers were talking about the abject horrors to which they're subjected when serving their country, and the effects these horrors have on their psyches. In that month, CNN was provided rare permission to interview several Russian captives by Ukraine. The outlet spoke to a man named Anton, who described his experience during the brutal Battle of Bakhmut. Russia lost up to 30,000 soldiers in that battle alone, the BBC reports, and Anton was very fortunate not to be one of them. He described jumping like rabbits under mortar rounds and bombs for 3 days as he and a fellow soldier, named Slava, simply tried to survive the fighting. At one point, they managed to fall asleep, only for Ukrainian shelling to blow a crater into the entrance of their foxhole. The two ran, picking their way through craters and mangled bodies. Eventually, Anton and Slava found their way into another foxhole. Safety didn't last long. Ukraine soldiers had been tracking them. 2 grenades were thrown into the foxhole, and Anton only survived because of how deep the hole ran. It was silent for a while, then the Ukrainians came back. I thought that was the end, Anton tells CNN. I switched the rifle to single shot mode and I thought I would shoot myself, but I couldn't. Anton was yet another of Russia's convict soldiers. His experience on the front line offers the perfect example of why Russian morale is so low that many in the country's military are turning their guns on their comrades. And if not their comrades, they take aim at themselves. Anton couldn't pull the trigger, but the fact that he was so desperate that he would have if he could says everything that's needed to know about the state of a Russian soldier's psyche during the most brutal battles to which Putin subjects them. Other Russian soldiers are far more willing to harm themselves if it means escaping from the horrors of war. In September, the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, wrote that there's an increasing trend among Russia's soldiers to commit acts of self-harm to escape their duties. These soldiers aren't freshly minted conscripts forced into battle for the first time either. CEPA says that the budding self-harm epidemic is being conducted by some of Russia's most elite soldiers as they try to escape the war and claim the compensation that they believe they're owed. One such scam involved 35 of Russia's high-ranking officials, officers, and private soldiers, CEPA says. Collectively, those soldiers stood to receive $2.4 million in state payments if they were sent back home after being wounded in the line of duty. One of the fraudsters, Guard Colonel Artem Gorodilov, reportedly had his soldiers shoot him 4 times under express orders to avoid vital organs so he could get back home with his money. 2 things become clear from this story. Even Russia's elite soldiers are desperate to get back home, and they're also far more concerned with money than they are with any sense of patriotic duty that Putin tries to instill into them. Is it any wonder that these soldiers are going crazy on the front lines? The stories about Russian commanders ordering the execution of their own and the systematic killing of the wounded mentioned earlier are all signs of a military that's entrenched in a culture of brutality. And for more proof of that, consider this other insane story from the front lines. On October 17, The Telegraph reported that Russian soldiers, who defy orders to go on suicidal advances into Ukrainian territory, are being handcuffed to trees and left to die. The outlet reports on a video demonstrating how 4 Russian soldiers were left to this fate. Abandoned without food or water by their supposed comrades, they could only hope that Ukraine soldiers would find them before starvation and dehydration did. Those soldiers weren't in Ukraine to fight. Not really. They were expendable cannon fodder sent to soak up Ukrainian bullets, and they knew it. Their commanders cared so little for their existences that they would rather allow those soldiers to die tortured deaths than provide them with any opportunity to avoid the fighting. Russia's military displays constant brutality in Ukraine, committing war crimes by the dozen. It should come as no surprise that this same brutality is directed toward any Russian soldier who dares to take even the smallest of steps out of line. By this point, the cracks in the Russian war machine are quite evident, and the stories of the country's military dysfunction are far from over. Thousands of Russia's soldiers have died in Ukraine. However, many of those who survived don't show any sort of respect to the dead. Instead, as Euromaidan press reports, they will often loot the bodies of their dead comrades as soon as the opportunity presents itself. The outlet says that the soldiers Russia deploys are often sent into combat with limited supplies. Equipment shortages have reached absurd levels, Euromaidan press claims. Many of Russia's soldiers are often sent into battle without the most basic of gear, such as boots and protective vests. So when a soldier dies who happens to have that gear, comrades often descend like vultures. In one example that Euromaidan press shares, a video of a Russian soldier yanking the helmet and vest off one of his dead comrades has been making the rounds. The soldier is almost gleeful as he loots, to the point where he sarcastically thanks his fallen comrade for the gear. Could this be the sign of a cracked mind? A soldier who's so numb to the horrors of the war and the brutality of his commanders that he's lost all sight of any value that his comrade's life may have held? Or is this a case of a soldier hiding his desperation behind a callous surface because he knows that his country has sent him into a fight ill-prepared and unlikely to survive? Either way, it doesn't change the fact that Russian soldiers are looting the bodies of their dead to scavenge whatever they can get that their own military fails to provide. In some cases, the looting is premeditated and combined with the killing of comrades discussed earlier in the video. In April, the Kyiv Post reported on an incident in which the Ukrainian organization I Want to Live intercepted a call from the Frontlines. I Want to Live provides Russian soldiers with the means to surrender themselves into Ukrainian captivity, though it also chronicles some of the terrible events in the Ukraine war. During the intercepted call, a Russian soldier says he's 500 when referring to another soldier. This is a military slang term that means the soldier disobeyed orders, and there can be only one consequence for that in the Russian military. We already took his stuff, though he was a 200, another soldier said, implying that he thought the soldier who disobeyed orders had been killed. He must have been killed, must have been shot, says another soldier, in a statement so frank that it reveals that Russia's standard practice is to kill anybody who disobeys orders. Another soldier adds that the 500 soldier is waiting to be extracted, leading to the soldier who started the conversation to comment, "He needs to be shot, he needs to be watched and shot." Again, the heartless pilfering of the dead in this incident is on plain display. Granted, there ended up being confusion about the fate of the soldier in question, but his comrades had already stolen everything that they could from him before they even learned of his fate. And once there was a hint that he might have survived, his supposed comrade said he should be shot. This is military dysfunction at an insane level, but again, it shouldn't come as a surprise. Even disregarding the desperation of soldiers who are scavenging gear just to stay alive, Russia itself is setting the example that what is owned by one can be taken by another. On July 30, the BBC published an article in which it revealed that the Russian state is stealing the money that it promised to give to its soldiers. The outlet tells the story of a soldier named Nikita Kursa, who decided to fight in the war against Ukraine because he knew that it paid well. That alone is a sign that all of the Kremlin propaganda about patriotism is bunk. Most of Russia's soldiers are there for the paycheck. How could they not be? In some regions, the $62,500 a soldier is offered for their first year of service, plus a similar amount in compensation if they're injured, is 600% more than the average national wage, the BBC says. When Kursa returned from fighting, he got drunk after an argument with his wife and decided to take his money in a plastic bag to buy an apartment for himself. He tried to drive, only to be pulled over by police officers. That seems reasonable. Kursa was driving under the influence. But instead of arresting him, the officers started arguing about whether they should force Kursa to bribe them with his plastic bag of money. "Let's not do this, he's just come back from the war," one officer said. "Shut up," the other one replied. "Do you know how much money that is?" The counter-argument was clearly compelling, as Kursa ended up giving the police almost $32,000 in cold hard cash, meaning about half of his Ukraine war pay vanished. The Russian system that had promised he would live life as one of the country's elite when he came back instead stole from him, just like Russia's soldiers steal from the bodies of their dead comrades. Kursa ended up back where he started, fighting in Putin's army to earn some money. Back to Russia's massive equipment shortages for a moment. Those shortages are now so widespread, Euromaidan Press reports, that Russia's soldiers are now fighting with weapons and ammunition that date back to World War II. The shortages go far beyond personal gear, as a video released by Ukraine's 225th Assault Regiment shows German detonators from World War II era found in a captured Russian ammunition depot, the outlet proclaims. The Sun YouTube channel shares a video that appears to prove this claim. In it, footage reveals Nazi-era German weapons and ammunition that Ukraine has recovered from the battlefield. The outlet claims that Russia's desperate soldiers are now breaking into museums to get their hands on old Nazi weapons to use against Ukraine. Hold on a second. Nazi weapons? This is from the military led by Putin, who's claimed many times in the past that one of the reasons for invading Ukraine was the supposed rise of fascism within the country. The followers of Nazi executioners, whatever they call themselves today, are doomed, Putin proclaimed in January 2024, adding that the regime in Kyiv glorifies Hitler's accomplices, the SS, yet it's Putin's soldiers who are reportedly seeking out Nazi-era weaponry. Now back to the types of Russian soldiers who kicked off this video covering Russia's frontline madness, the conscripts. Russia's conscripts have been drafted into its military. However, they're not supposed to face any fighting, at least during their 12 months of mandatory service. Conscripts aren't paid, and they shouldn't be deployed to combat zones or outside Russia unless they sign a contract. But, as with every other aspect of the Ukraine war, Russia finds ways to break its own rules. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, or RFE-RL, reported on one of those ways in May. It said that Russia has started offering its conscripts contracts to serve in Ukraine just 4 months into their conscription. Some sign up willingly, others, the outlet says, are coerced into signing, which only feeds the hopelessness that is so badly affecting Russian morale. A conscript who may once have endured their military service because they wouldn't have to fight and would go home afterward, instead faces the prospect of being pushed into a fight that they don't want to take part in. One of those conscripts, named Alexander, explained the quality of the training he received. As far as training goes, we did target practice a couple of times and that was it. There was no special training, Alexander told RFE-RL. He had been sent to Bryansk to dig trenches as part of his conscription. When Ukrainian soldiers counter-invaded nearby Kursk, Alexander the conscript ended up on the front. Senior officers ordered him, along with other conscripts, to forward positions. Behind them was a second line of defense containing actual professional soldiers who had far better equipment. Russia was going to use these conscripts as cannon fodder. Alexander concludes his tale with a story that's become all too familiar. Once we were under fire for several hours. We were sent on a scouting mission and then the Ukrainian armed forces came out. We couldn't run back. Our own people would shoot us for giving away our location. We lay down and waited for several hours. The most important part of this quote is clear. Our own people would shoot us. By now, it's evident that Alexander is likely telling the truth. There is far too much evidence of Russia doing that very thing shared in this video alone. And this ultimately is what the Russian military really is. Once feared as one of the world's most powerful military forces, Russia's military has come apart at the seams. Now, it's soldiers who don't know if the bullet that kills them will come from a Ukrainian soldier or one of their own comrades. Russia just entered a red alert situation. Its increasingly desperate leader, Vladimir Putin, is scrambling. His country is gripped by panic, his cities are burning, and his economy is going up in smoke. And it's all thanks to Ukraine raining down hell on Russian infrastructure. Running out of options, the Russian president just made one of the biggest and boldest calls of the war so far. A decision that will have lasting implications, one way or another, but also a decision that shows how hopeless the situation is becoming for the Kremlin. On October 22, the Russian military announced that it was calling up army reservists from across the country to defend its infrastructure on home soil. Vice Admiral Vladimir Smolyansky, Deputy Chief of the main Organizational and Mobilization Directorate of the Russian General Staff, otherwise known as the head of Russia's conscription office, announced the news in a televised address, and there's a lot that can be learned from what he said. The Vice Admiral started off by saying the following. In order to increase the level of security for critical infrastructure and other facilities vital to the well-being of citizens, a decision has been made to engage the most prepared and patriotic citizens in carrying out measures to protect civilian facilities deep in Russia's territory. Already, this reveals a lot. First, it's a sign that Russia is remarkably desperate, because it would never make this kind of announcement unless it really had to. For a long time now, Putin and his Kremlin officials have been putting on a brave face in front of the public, relying on their usual tricks of lies, propaganda and truth spinning to paint a picture that the war is going well, that Russia is on the path to victory, that the economy has withstood the assault of Western sanctions, and that Ukrainian forces are on the ropes as Russian troops gain ground by the day. Of course, the rest of the world knows the truth. But within Russia itself, where large parts of the population get their news fed to them by state-owned TV channels and newspaper reports, it's relatively easy for the Kremlin to control what people believe. And it goes to great lengths to cover up the harsh realities of the conflict, masking the facts whenever and however it can. Now, however, Russia's leadership has had to openly admit that things aren't quite going to plan. They're letting the public know that Ukraine's attacks on their own infrastructure are becoming far too dangerous, and that the existing defenses simply aren't sufficient to stop Kyiv's drone strikes. They need more help, and since the army is already too busy fighting along the front lines of Ukraine, they're turning to reservists to strap on their boots and defend their homeland from future Ukrainian strikes. And that leads to the second big thing that can be learned from the Russian Vice Admiral's words. Ukraine's attacks are working. For months now, Ukraine has carried out a strategic, systematic aerial assault on the most important pieces of infrastructure over the border and across Russia's regions, paying special attention to energy and fuel-related locations. oil refineries, fuel storage tanks and pipelines have been blown up and wiped off the map by Ukraine's precision strikes, with massive explosions ringing out and thick clouds of smoke filling the air. Fires have broken out and raged through the night, with great flames lighting the skies as gallons upon gallons of fuel burn up in a matter of minutes. On their own, individual attacks like this might not mean all that much in the grand scheme of things, but added up, their effects have most certainly taken a massive toll on Russia's economy and its war machine. As a result, a huge fuel crisis is starting to spread far and wide across Russia, affecting numerous regions and multiple major cities, where people are being forced to pay extortionate prices and line up for hours to just get a tank full of gas. Many fuel stations in the affected regions have reduced service or imposed limitation due to shortages, and some have even been forced to shut down, while those that are still open are having to impose strict purchase caps and other restrictions to stop the crisis getting any worse. Ukraine shows no signs of stopping its attacks, and Russia has so far done a pathetic job of defending itself. As such, it appears the only option left is to call up reservists and task them with guarding the pipelines, factories and refineries that are still left standing. Vice Admiral Smolyansky went on to explain that the reservists will first need to undergo special training before being deployed to watch over important infrastructure locations. A draft law clarifies the purposes for which reservists are used, providing for the possibility of sending them to special training camps to protect vital infrastructure, energy, transport, oil refineries and other infrastructure only in their region. As the officer explained, a new draft law is being prepared by the Russian Ministry of Defense. According to official statements, this law will only allow for reservists to protect infrastructure locations, like transport hubs and oil refineries, in their regions and within Russia itself. The Kremlin appeared extremely eager to convey that this was not akin to a nationwide mobilization, and that reservists are in a very different category when compared to contract soldiers fighting on the front lines. The Vice Admiral went on to explain this point. In particular, I would like to point out that it's important not to confuse reservists with contract soldiers, active military personnel. The main difference between reservists and contract soldiers is that they can combine their time in the reserve with their primary employment. Reservists are not military personnel and have all the rights of civilians. Reservists are citizens who previously served in the armed forces or other security agencies and who voluntarily enter into a contract to serve in the reserves. So, if what the Vice Admiral is saying is to be believed, these reservists will be more like part-time National Guard. They'll continue to be allowed to live their lives, work their usual jobs, and remain connected to their families while serving, maintaining all the rights of a Russian civilian, but will also need to lend their time, energy, and military expertise to defending high-value locations from Ukrainian attacks. The Vice Admiral then doubled down on this point, specifically stating that the new draft law should not be seen as any sort of mobilization, and that mobilization was not even being talked about at this time. The draft law, developed on the initiative of the Russian Defense Ministry, does not affect all citizens and does not facilitate their conscription into military service, to special military operation zones or deployment outside the country. Moreover, there is no talk of mobilization. If there's one thing that history has taught, it's that the words of the Kremlin officials cannot be trusted. They are masters of mistruth and propaganda and have a proven track record of saying one thing, then doing another. Thus, it's certainly possible that, despite the Vice Admiral's claims, this is in fact part of a larger strategy that could eventually prove to be a full-scale mobilization of the approximately 2 million reservists in the Russian ranks, who have all signed reservist contracts but are not usually obligated to serve. And even though the Vice Admiral also stated that these reservists will only be called on to defend their own territories and will not be dispatched to any special military operation zones like Donetsk, Luhansk and other occupied regions of Ukraine, official statements reaffirmed that they will not be sent to these areas or outside of Russia. However, given Moscow's past flexibility with its own rules, questions remain about whether that policy could quietly change in the future, ultimately sending some or even all of these so-called reservists straight to the frontline territories. There are a few pieces of evidence backing up this possibility. Firstly, it wouldn't be the first time that Russia has blatantly lied about its true intentions. In fact, as previously mentioned, Putin's regime has made a habit out of saying one thing but doing the opposite, and recent history is littered with examples of this. On multiple occasions when speaking with US President Donald Trump, for example, Putin allegedly showed a willingness to end the war and spoke openly about negotiating some sort of ceasefire or peace agreement, only to bombard Ukraine with record-setting drone and missile attacks a day or two later. Before the war began, Kremlin officials also repeatedly claimed that there would be no war, that the rest of the world was lying and fear-mongering, and that Russia had no plans to send troops into the Donbas region. Vladimir Chizov, for instance, the former Russian ambassador to the European Union, said in January 2022, mere days before the invasion began. Russia has no plans to invade either Ukraine or any other country. It's a bluff created not in Russia, but in those countries that are now spreading this hysterical message across Europe and the world. Even the fact that Russia always refers to the war as a special military operation is another page from the same playbook. It's a way of weaponizing language, using the right words and terms to introduce ideas in a soft or gentle way, only revealing the full ugly truth at a much later date. The very same scenario may be playing out once more. First, the Kremlin could softly introduce this idea of reservists voluntarily taking arms to defend their regions. Then, a month or two down the line, it could make a second announcement, revealing that some of those valiant reservists are on their way to the front lines. The second piece of evidence to back up this possibility is the fact that the Vice Admiral seems so eager to stress that this wasn't a mobilization. In his address, he repeatedly brought up the concept that the reservists were completely different from contract soldiers, that they were purely there on a voluntary basis, and that they had signed contracts to serve their country. He appeared desperate to get the message across that this was all fair and reasonable, that nobody was being forced into service, and that those involved would only be stationed in locations across the Russian Federation and nowhere else. Of course, he may have been perfectly honest and upfront in what he said. But usually, whenever someone, especially a Kremlin official, keeps repeating and emphasizing the same ideas over and over, it's because they've got something to hide. They're desperate to convey a particular side of the story so that people don't ask too many questions or start having too many doubts. And that may be exactly what's happening here. There's no way of knowing for sure for the time being, but it's clear that the Vice Admiral was under strict orders to emphasize certain points and preempt possible concerns from the public. Only time will tell why the Kremlin was so eager to frame its announcement in such a specific way. But many analysts won't be surprised if these same reservists begin appearing in assaults on Pokros or other frontline locations in the not-so-distant future. In addition, don't forget that, in the eyes of Vladimir Putin, all of Ukraine belongs to Russia and should technically be classed as part of the Russian Federation. That's exactly what Putin said earlier this year, telling attendees at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum on June 20, "I've said many times that I considered the Russian and Ukrainian peoples to be one people. In this sense, all of Ukraine is ours. We have an old rule. Wherever a Russian soldier sets foot is ours." So, the new draft law allegedly states that the reservists will only be deployed to locations within Russia. But Putin also says that all of Ukraine is technically part of Russia. Thus, it's easy to see how this whole reservist plan could be twisted into something more closely resembling a full-scale mobilization. And the third reason to back that up can be summarized in a single word: money. There's no doubt about it, the Russian economy is in freefall. The country was able to partially cushion the impact of Western sanctions and the enormous cost of fueling the war for the first couple of years, thanks to a lot of planning, preparation, and relatively smart moves on the Kremlin's part, like building up a strong war chest, strengthening trade relations with countries like India and China, and reducing Russia's reliance on Western imports and technologies, though inflation and extremely high interest rates have continued to weigh heavily on the economy. Now, however, as the conflict approaches its 4th anniversary, Russia is fully feeling the heat. Sanctions have slowly but surely taken a toll, cutting Russia's banks, businesses and elites off from international travel, trade and exchange. The value of the Russian ruble has become unstable, inflation and interest rates are sky high, recession is almost inevitable, and Ukraine's effective attacks on fuel sites and oil infrastructure have multiplied and magnified the Kremlin's financial woes in record time. In response, Russia is at last trying to find ways to cut costs wherever it can. It refuses to stop the war, and in many ways it can't even afford to do so, since so much of its money is now tied up in the military-industrial complex. But it does appear interested in slashing some of its more excessive areas of expenditure, and recruitment is likely to fall into that category. Even after suffering colossal casualties, with some estimates suggesting that Russia's total losses could be above 1.4 million by now, with close to 500,000 soldiers dead, the Kremlin continues to recruit heavily, bringing tens of thousands of new troops into the fold each month. But it's having to resort to increasingly desperate and expensive measures to maintain those numbers, offering huge cash incentives to entice citizens into signing up. A report from RE Russia, published earlier this year, found that Russia had spent just over 2 trillion rubles, $24.6 billion on manpower in the first half of 2025. That included 400 billion rubles for signing bonuses for new recruits, 860 billion rubles on service pay for the hundreds of thousands of active duty soldiers in Ukraine, and over 750 billion rubles more in compensation to the families of the dead and the wounded. If those rates stay the same for the rest of the year, then by the end of 2025, Russia will have spent more than 4 trillion rubles, close to $50 billion, just on recruiting troops to replenish its ranks, paying soldiers' salaries, and compensating their loved ones. That's the equivalent of 2% of Russia's entire GDP and almost 10% of the year's federal budget. It's an extraordinary amount of money, and with other reports revealing that Russia is spending around 2 billion rubles, $24 million every day, just on signing bonuses for new troops, it's easy to see how utterly unsustainable this system is. Thus, rather than continuing to shell out extravagant amounts of money to get new soldiers onto the battlefield, with many of them likely to be killed or wounded before they even have a chance of making any sort of impact, Russia's leaders may feel that it's much more cost-effective to make good use of their extensive amount of reservists. All they have to do is figure out some sort of legal loophole that gives them the power to deploy reservists to Ukraine, and this new draft law could do just that, according to analysts from the US-based Institute for the Study of War, ISW, which recently shared a detailed breakdown of the Kremlin's latest legislative actions, entitled, "Warning: the Kremlin is preparing to mobilize reservists on a rolling basis to fight in Ukraine for the first time." In the report, the ISW explains that Russia's existing recruitment systems are losing momentum and proving too costly for the Kremlin to sustain. Russia's main method for generating manpower through high financial incentives and price surging is reportedly losing momentum and hitting diminishing returns as of October 2025. Russian military recruitment offices are failing to increase recruitment rates despite increasing payments, a tactic that has previously raised recruitment rates in 2023 and 2024. The Kremlin's current method of generating volunteers was already facing financial challenges as of early 2025. As a result, the Institute claims that Russia has been building up its strategic reserve for some time. A Russian insider source that has consistently provided accurate reports about changes in the Russian military command stated on September 21 that roughly 292,000 people signed contracts with the Russian MOD, and that some of these recruits are joining the strategic reserve. The new draft amendment, adopted on October 13, may provide the legal mechanism to activate elements of this reserve. The ISW goes on to share its view that the Kremlin will likely use this new draft law amendment to deploy active reservists into combat more rapidly than was possible under the previous mechanism that required a formal declaration of war or mobilization order. It adds that this method may help Russia in generating forces much more cheaply, saving money on signing bonuses and other recruitment costs, which may provide some light relief for the country's floundering economy. At the same time, the ISW notes that this approach could easily backfire on Putin, especially if large parts of the Russian public see through the lies and understand that reservists are being forcefully dispatched to Ukraine against their will. The Kremlin will likely invest significant resources in convincing the Russian people that reservists who deployed to Ukraine did so voluntarily. Compulsory military service remains unattractive and controversial, and Putin may face greater domestic political risks if the Kremlin fails to convince the Russian people that mobilized reservists killed in Ukraine went to Ukraine voluntarily. In short, the Kremlin is walking a very dangerous tightrope with this decision. Even if it only intends to use reservists to defend Russian territories for the time being, it's a plan that may prove pointless since Ukraine has already shown it knows how to bypass Russian defenses with its drones and missiles and will continue to strike at the Kremlin's oil infrastructure, transport hubs, and other important locations in the weeks and months to come. More Russian troops in and around those locations won't be enough to save them. If anything, it will only lead to more avoidable casualties and even greater losses for the country. If, however, Russia has bigger plans and intends to send these reserve troops all the way to Ukraine, it may have to deal with an increasingly angry and outraged public, many of whom are already sick and tired of the war and eager to see it come to an end. Now, learn more about how resentment, dissent, and even rebellion are beginning to rise up across Russian regions in this video, which looks at some of how Russia's indigenous peoples are starting to strike back at Moscow in more ways than one. Alternatively, for a closer look at what's happening within the walls of the Kremlin itself, watch this video, exploring how Putin's paranoia has triggered an unprecedented purge of Russian officials and put the president in the most precarious position of his entire career. And finally, subscribe to our channel too, and turn on notifications so you can be one of the first to learn about the latest biggest news and developments from the front lines of the Russia-Ukraine war and other important conflicts across the world.